Good evening. Good evening in Europe. I would like to welcome you to our PoSoCoMeS seminar. Today we are talking about the book Weaponizing the Past, Collective Memory and Jews, Poles and Communists in 21st Century Poland, published by Berghahn Books in 2023. This book is written by Kate Korycki, who is our guest, our author today. And I would like to welcome Brian Porter-Szűcs, who will be our discussant today. This book looks at how political leaders in Poland use the memories of communism to push their own agendas, and it also shows us the links that are set in Poland between communism and Jewishness, and how both are connected and all really often framed as an evil. And also the book talks also about how this influenced the ideas of democracy, and how those narratives support right-wing populism, and how they shape the way of thinking by people in Poland at the present. Kate Korycki is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at the Western University in Canada, what is really pretty east of Canada, as we talked before. And she studies how stories about the past create collective identities and how those identities affect power and inequality in today's world. And our discussant, Brian Porter-Szűcs, is an Arthur F. Turner Professor of History at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's historian and focused on Poland economics ideas and values under communism. His upcoming book, Commodify Communism, Socialist Values and Capitalist Prices in the Polish People's Republic, explore how socialist ideals clashed with capitalist realities in Polish People's Republic. So, Kate, Brian, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for taking your time and being here today, and I hope for a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Okay, let me start by sharing my screen. Can everybody see it? Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Alina, for inviting me to your seminar. Thank you, Brian, for your deep reading and comments, and all of you being here. I look forward to your thoughts and comments and our conversations after. I will speak for about 20 minutes, then yield the floor to Brian, and then we'll open it up. In 1989, Poland and the wider region experienced a profound rupture in the fabric of time. The society organized politically, socially, and economically in one way was within a space of 1 year organized entirely differently. People made into citizens by an autocratic and communist regime transitioned to democratic and capitalist ways of belonging and participating. This rupture was greeted with enthusiasm, but it was also terribly costly. It resulted in many things gained and many things lost. This happened in 1989, 2 years after I had left Poland at 18. When I arrived back, in a matter of weeks after my arrival, when I arrived back to begin my research in 2013, that is 24 years after the transition, the presence of the past was palpable in all spheres of life. During my first walk in Warsaw Old Town, in a space of 2 kilometers, I encountered 9 art and other public installations, 6 of which dealt directly with the past and the process of remembering. In a matter of weeks after my arrival, on November 11th, I went to 4 out of 11 marches that took place that day in Warsaw alone. All were commemorating in their separate ways a national holiday, the end of World War I and Polish regained statehood. One of the marches marches was organized by and led by the then president of the Republic. One group, the movements organized by the nationalists. One was a loose the LGBTQ, anarchy, and progressive movements. Another one, still tiny one, marched under a flag. I'll explain the monikers of patriots, managers, etc. Shortly. In 150 interviews with politicians, judges, housing activists and squatters, artists and academics, I realized that all public and political debate was conducted through the medium of memory. The past was invoked directly, or it served as a pervasive justificatory framework. It was toyed with, deployed instrumentally. Some repudiated its use. In the Foucauldian paradox, however, even in the repudiation, the past was confirmed as the organizing principle, the language of public and political life. This was so true that in 2015, that is the empirical anchor of the book, 2015 elections were won by a party which claimed that communism, which had in Poland in 1989, was still ruling Poland. So in the book, I take the charge of the persisting communism seriously, not in substantive sense, but in analytical one. That is to say, I do not give credence to the notion that communism ruled Poland in 2015, but I track the political productivity of such a formulation. The concrete research questions that guided my tracking were: one, why, how, and to what end do political elites narrate the past? And two, what do the narratives tell us about the ways nations are imagined and reimagined or constituted in the mundane political speech? And I was moved to the first set of questions by the empirical reality of Poland, in which the main political parties did not differ greatly in terms of their programs. But despite the lack of programmatic delineation, they were locked in a deep and positional conflict. And as I alluded to already, they all devoted much of their energy to narrating the past, especially communism. I was moved to the second question of to the content or the meaning of stories by the basic assumption of collective memory literature, which sees remembering as constitutive of groupness. More specifically, as most of you will know, collective memory literature assumes that remembering is a dialogic process. That it's not enough to share experience. Instead, one needs to narrate it, talk about it, represent it in some collective process. Second, collective memory literature assumes that the remembering of the past is deeply partial or presentist. That is to say, what matters is not the historical truth about what is being said, but the fact that remembering is done in the present and for the purpose of the present. Some call this process an invention of usable pasts. In trying to identify what makes the past usable, I turned the spotlight on the creative manipulation, ordering, and judgment of the past, and I proposed the concept of mnemonic capital. Mnemonic capital is a means by which parties in post-transition space limit the field of legitimate players and structure the field internally. What this means is that not only those who wield mnemonic capital can contest leading positions, and the way that capital is deployed assigns stable roles and identities to the players. The capital is gained by turning to the past and by different ways that parties judge or more concretely condemn the past. I identify 3 stable mainstream positions given by mnemonic capital and 1 excluded one. I rely on Bourdieusian notions of capitals, but I add my own and I call it mnemonic. So the 3 mainstream positions are the patriots who turn to the past openly and belligerently. They condemn communism forcefully by making it imposed by external and hostile others, then make it hostile to the very notion of Polishness. The managers style themselves as present-day oriented, but they invoke communism all the time, indirectly, condemning it for irrationality and a lack of freedom, which in their current narration, they conflate with market freedom. Communism serves as a justificatory framework for what they want to do in the present. The liberals, who are the old Communist Party, use the past in a deliberate fashion, recognizing it as an organizing principle of the political life. They wouldn't do it if it wasn't for the fact that it's hard to be seen as a legible player without it. They too condemn communism for its mistakes while retrieving some of its goodness. The objectors, the groups that are shut out of the political game, refuse to turn to the past and condemn communism and are thus not quite viable political subjects. They demonstrate the structuring force of mnemonic capital. If you do not pay the toll at the toll booth of anti-communism, you cannot enter the field. The slide means to introduce the players, but also show you that they've been powerful for a long time and that they've been talking about the past for a long time. So in short, mnemonic capital, the way parties invest in the narrative and condemnation of the past, is what allows them to appear sharply distinct to each other and to their voters. The sharp distinction is a sine qua non condition of competition in representative democracy. There need to be parties, and they need to appear different. Usually this is done with platforms or programs. In Poland, this condition was most reliably fulfilled by the way that parties talk about and judge communism. After sorting the political productivity of the past talk, the stable identity of the parties, I turned attention to the content of the narratives, and I accepted and who was excluded, could others join, on what conditions, and were others conceived as equal or inferior. So in tracing the narratives, I found that contrary to parties' stated commitment to three ways of belonging or joining a community, which they identified as participation in the polity, self-identification with the polity, and ascription, the three main players converged on ascription. In the way they narrated communism, which they did to gain political identity, they all conflated communism with Jewishness. And in doing so, they narrowed the conception of national belonging to ethno-religious one. Let me give you a taste of how this was done by placing it within the contours of a major debate within the collective memory field. As I said, collective memory scholars agree that collective remembering is partial and presentist, but they disagree on the importance of manipulation in the process of memory construction. On the one hand, we have Jeffrey Olick, who claims that the concept's greatest value lies in its sustained attention to multiplicity, distortion, contestation over meaning. On the other hand is Barry Schwartz, who argues that the persistent focus on contestation has led collective memory scholars away from theorizing that which collective memory does best, namely how it binds and works to cohere a group. So my approach doesn't resolve the dispute, but it uses both insights sequentially. I first analyze the multiplicity of narratives, paying attention to their variants, and second, relying on Schwartz's concept of redundancy, I isolate the repeated themes and tropes, organizing the emergent imaginary community. So here is how different groups narrate the past. Polish, Jewish, and communist imbrications were central to the account of center-right cluster, the Patriot. In the Patriot's narration, Poles were placed in competition of suffering with the Jewish people, and Poles were narrated to win this competition. They were narrated as having suffered more than Jews did in the Holocaust. This was achieved by first making communism equally repellent to Nazism, a notion that's popular in other places and problematic everywhere. Then making it existentially threatening to Poles. And third, it was made to be coincidental with Jewishness. In this construction, Jews become communism, and they become carriers of communism, as if it were a pestilence. And as such, they become existential enemies of the Poles. This, of course, excused all violence that Poles perpetrated on Jews, and Poles emerged innocent. And communism as a hostile force became inscribed in the body of a person. It became irredeemably other, as if racial. In sharp contrast, Polish-Jewish relations were ostensibly marginal in the account of the managers. Its framers deplored the trope of Polish innocence advanced by the patriots. Instead, the party called for a deep self-reflection about the limits of societal difference. And guilty only of being indifferent majority. Queer scholarship called this process triangulation. So the story of the communist successor party, the formation I call the liberals, did not address the Holocaust or Polish-Jewish communism involvement at all. They condemned anti-Semitism in 3 short remarks, and then they left the topic shrouded in silence. The silence was significant in this narrative because the author wrote it explicitly to correct stories told by others. In such a context, silence indicated agreement. As different as these stories were, and they were different, they shared a number of features and themes. So first, they advanced the story from the point of view of ethnically, indeed in one account racially defined Poles. No matter how much the narrators invoked a civic conception of belonging or claimed to respect individual choice in a matter of self-identification, no matter how much pride the narrators took in the tradition of Polish multiculturalism, they all segregated the communities in the storytelling. They assumed the authority to decide who was a Pole and who was a Jew, and they did this deciding based on blood. And they relegated the story of those who made Poland diverse to the role of a prop in a drama of the majority or its primary villain. Second, and most concretely, the narratives of the patriots and the managers conflated communism with Jewishness. As I stated above, patriots did this directly and openly. The managers ostensibly rejected the Jew as the communist conflation. Its storytellers call it a myth and a superstition. Curiously, however, when Jewish people actually made it into a story, they were narrated at the helm of the secret security apparatus, the main tool of Stalinist terror in Poland, where they were declared by the Polish storytellers to be A, Jewish, and B, legitimately vengeful. The effect of this myth, and it is a myth, is similar to the direct conflation of the patriots. In lieu of racially coded communists, we were given a vengeful Jewish torturer. Both were invented, and both were invented as acting against the Poles. The communist successor party did not undermine the hegemonic narrative. Indeed, it strengthened its power by silence and agreement. As such, the 3 major political camps supplied their citizens with a consonant story of the past-derived, ethnically coded enemy other. In doing so, they elevated the ethnic principle of nationhood in which one is a legitimate member only by sharing in and self-identifying with the Polish version of history or Polish memory. The only vision of non-members is also ethnically coded and made to be inherently hostile. To add a final strand and conclude, let me bring the story to the present and kind of offer a comparative angle to it. Populist parties organize political demands by mobilizing moral people against the oligarchs, the corrupt elite, the political class, the swamp. Populist parties on the left posit the people-oligarch dividing line in economic terms. Populist parties on the right posit people-oligarch line in nationalist exclusivist lines. As you can intuit, populist parties on the right have a problem once they get to office. The problem lies in the fact that once in office, they are the political class. Thus, in order to maintain the level of condensing and electrifying crisis, to use Judith Butler's words, they invent external threats to which they continue to be the manifest saviors. Those threats are always and everywhere migrants, and they are presented as threats to cultural purity or economic status of the locals. And external powers like the EU, which is presented as an overarching bully threatening national sovereignty, or gender ideology or critical race theory, which threaten property rights of parents over their children, or pro-Palestinian protester, or indeed in Palestinian itself, presenting a threat to existence. In other words, invented enemies are powerfully useful. But as the Polish case makes clear, the sellability of this narrative is nurtured and fertilized by a conception of belonging in which any new member or newly invented member are made to be inherently hostile. And as the Polish case makes clear, the production of that conception takes time, it takes active effort, and it takes redundancy. That is a repetitious and unpunctured story, which establishes the principle of belonging as importantly as actual others. What this suggests is that telling other stories matters, as it keeps the field of possibility open. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Kate. And also thank you to the organizers of this event because I'm so glad that I have the opportunity to be here today and to talk about this this fascinating book. As you all have just heard, this volume offers a penetrating and I think very astute critical analysis of the political scene in Poland, mostly focusing on 2005 to 2015, very key years there. Undeniably, actually, a crucial decade. Consequences clearly visible to this day. In particular, Kate has helped us see more clearly how, I think the strongest point of the book is how the anti-communist intelligentsia of the 1980s and 1990s planted the seeds for their own defeat, in a way. Most of the existing scholarship has talked about this in a certain way, focusing on the way neoliberal economic policies marginalized a large segment of society, and how that, of course, generated frustrations, creating openings for authoritarian demagogues. But what I think this presentation that Kate has just summarized now offers is a step further, looking at how the historical politics of the early 21st century configured lines of exclusion and inclusion with implications that go way beyond the economic realm. And that leaves me with a bit of a problem because I have no polemic with this argument. It's extremely strong. It's spot on. So what I want to do with my time here today is sort of come at the argument sideways a little bit. I want to organize into two parts, which I hope might facilitate further discussion. First, I want to zoom out to the macro level and discuss some of the theoretical implications of the book. And in this, I want to put on my hat as a historian in order to offer some thoughts about how this argument flows across our disciplinary divide. And then second, I want to zoom in and talk about some of the very specifically Polish implications of the argument. This also, I think, involves looking across a divide. Instead of a disciplinary divide, a chronological divide. Because reading this book in 2025, a book that focuses mainly on a period before 2015, I think offers some interesting thoughts, some provocations. So to start, I confess I was at first reading the introduction. and the first chapter. I was a little disoriented. And the reasons for my momentary confusion, I realized soon enough, came from reading the book as a historian, or more specifically, and I think this is probably an important qualification, a historian trained in the United States. So the first disorientation came from a comment that Kate makes on page 18. Allow me to cite this. Quote, to be sure, some historians engage in the process of collective remembering. Many of the narratives analyzed in this book, even if they were written for and used by political elites, were penned by historians. But historiography as a field overlaps with collective memory slightly and arguably uncomfortably. This is because the fields are organized by different rules and purposes, even as both may relate to the same events. This is best exemplified by collective memory's presentist outlook. In the present. The first citation that left me a little disoriented. The second is from the introduction on page 4, where Kate says, quote, mainstream literature on the topic on identity sees nations as historical and static, as invented in their generality about 200 years ago, implemented in their particularity and plurality since then, and simply persisting by the force of normativity. Now, at first I was thinking, I was a little confused there because those don't correspond to what I understood as the norms of the discipline, norms of my fields, either that history more generally or identity politics more specifically. I don't mean this as a criticism at all. Instead, it points to the challenges of reading across academic disciplines and sites of study. So historians don't usually use the phrase memory studies to talk about a subfield that we engage in. And I think the reason for that is because that's the entire discipline of history, at least as practiced here in the United States. You're probably all familiar with Hayden White's classic book, Meta-History. That came out in 1973. And by the time I was a graduate student in the 1980s, meta-history was taught as one of the foundational texts of our discipline. It was, you got that, in your first class in your first year of doctoral studies. The primary theoretical journal in our field, the appropriately named History and Theory, it's a magnificent journal, has basically built on the foundation of Hayden White's work and treats that kind of as a given. From which you sort of start the historical investigations. So even before the invasion of French theory in the 1980s and 90s, historians who were serious about historical theory were pretty gleefully deconstructing our own discipline. My department here at the University of Michigan has a course that we offer to very beginning students, the 18, 19-year-olds who come into our undergraduate program. It's required of all second-year majors. And in that class, they read Triot, for example, right at the very beginning. They read White. They read others similar. And we teach them that as historians, they have no access to the past. It's a line that we quite often say. The past is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. All we have are documents that exist in the present, and we as scholars engage with those documents. And this means, and we also stress this in that class, that history is always inevitably a battlefield, a site of contestation. The production of academic history is in no way separate from the cultural moment in which it is written. We are every bit as much engaged in weapons manufacturing, to use Kate's metaphor of the battlefield here, as any politician or other intellectual. Now, our weapons are deployed with different rules of engagement, but I think I'm on solid ground by saying that no serious historian would claim to be above the fray. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who call themselves historians who might make that claim. But if you look at the premier journals in our field, American Historical Review, Journal of Modern History, Past and Present, periodicals like that, I think you will find that this is pretty strongly the consensus position. Similarly, and related to this, nowadays it's quite hard to find scholars who treat nations as fixed and static vessels of identity. Now, again, when I entered the field in the 1980s, those debates were very real. The work of Anderson, Hobsbawm, Gellner, Roch, a number of others, they all came out in the early 1980s, so just as I was sort of entering the field. It took a few years for those work to become canonical, but the process was surprisingly fast, certainly among my generation of historians trained in North America. This was we just loved this stuff. Among my colleagues in the doctoral program, and then later as young scholars, one rarely encountered even debates. By the 1990s, historians, and I would include myself in this regard, were already critiquing Benedict Anderson and saying that his work was problematic because, precisely as Kate so astutely described, it posits the imagining of a nation and then the nation is there. So it doesn't problemize historical time adequately. It just posits a creational moment. And by the time we get into the early aughts, there's a whole wave of scholarship that pushes beyond this. So much so that in I think it was 2009, I wrote an article called Beyond the Study of Nationalism, in which I said this field's basically over because we've all deconstructed it so thoroughly and utterly that there's very little left to say. That's the hubris of a mid-career scholar trying to make a name for himself there on that. But still, I think it captures a moment in the field. Now, having said all that, that's not to say that we as historians embrace what Kate is called in this book, presentism. There was a famous book by William Sewell that I could recommend to everyone. It's old now. It came out in 2005, called Logics of History. In that, Bill Sewell points out that historians differ from social scientists in one crucial aspect. We have one methodological concept that we kind of claim as our own, and that is time. To put this in the terms used in this book, every memory struggle changes the ground on which future struggles are fought. So the methodological implication of this recognition are actually quite vast when you start to think about it, because they force us to confront the fact that, well, actually, every term in our political vocabulary, certainly, terms like memory itself, but also terms like nations, states, constitutions, development, democracies, political parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that all of these exist within a discursive flow, and that discursive flow exists in time, moving through time. For this reason, when, as a historian, I read the work of really almost most scholars in the social scientists, there's a grammatical disorientation that strikes me, and this refers back to my opening comments. In Polish, there's a difference between perfective and imperfective verbs. Well, historians don't like the imperfective verbs, or to put it differently, we like past tense and get nervous about present tense. So I would be very nervous about making any claims about the role of memory politics or the role of mnemonic capital, which is, by the way, a really great phrase that Kate coins here. That the role of mnemonic capital in transitions of democracy, because I would immediately want to historicize the particular instantiation of memory politics, the concept of transition, the concept of democracy, and all of the framing apparatus of the argument. So for this reason, I'm always a little bit nervous about typologies and definitions that diverge too far from the time and place of the actual historical and contextual usages. I want to elaborate on that point because I don't want to be misunderstood. To do that elaboration, let me move back to Kate's book and move into the specifics of the argument about Poland. So if we look at the terminology that Kate has just introduced to us to describe the political landscape in Poland, I do think we see a difference with how a historian would be inclined to write about this material and how a social scientist would. For example, so as you had just heard, Kate describes 4 political groupings: patriots, managers, liberals, and objectors. Let me take those one by one. In Poland, and not only there, but very strongly in Poland, there's been a long-standing terminological differentiation between nationalism and patriotism. The former refers to the tradition of national democracy, the endecja, the far right, tends to carry a negative connotation, although nowadays there are some activists on the far right who are reclaiming the concept of nationalism as a and in and many patriots the Now, I'm not suggesting that this terminology, this distinctly Polish contextualized terminology, is correct in any abstract sense, but I do think it's important that we grapple with the gap between the way we might want to formulate our research terminology and the way in which our subjects do. Similar issue comes up with the group that Kate presents as the managers. As I was reading this, basically, I felt like I was reading about neoliberals. Now, I also understood, I think, and I'm projecting here, so maybe Kate can correct me if I'm wrong, I think I understood why that term is avoided in this book, because a key figure in that chapter is Jacek Kuron. Well, he can't be called a neoliberal by any definition, right? So and the same broadly applies to that generation of intelligentsia dissidents, people who who were very active in the 70s and 80s. They acquiesced to neoliberalism in the 1990s, but I think using that term with them clearly creates a problem. So I understand that, but in that chapter, what Kate is focusing on is the aspects of their worldview, and this would apply to Kuron as much as anybody else, that focus on the embrace of homo economicus and broadly laissez-faire reasoning, market reasoning. So what we see is, even among people who would not call themselves neoliberals and probably shouldn't be called neoliberals, we can see the way in which neoliberalism becomes a defining feature of their political identity. And then we get to the third group, the liberals. This used to, as you just heard, used to refer to the post-communist party, SLD, in a way that was somewhat counterintuitive. Now, I obviously, Kwasniewski, clearly he did abandon social democracy in favor of a sort of liberalism that we might have seen captured in the 1990s by his peers, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, later by Barack Obama and others. But that was far from universal among the SLD. That particular move was not, I don't think, characteristic of the group as a whole. In any case, that's not what matters. What matters is that the focus here is on mnemonic politics, which is the one part of their worldview that did not intersect with liberalism or neoliberalism. It's very hard to imagine Clinton or Blair having fond things to say about the PRL. Right? This is the one thing that I think keeps us from using the word liberal, I would say, to apply to this group. So liberalism, of course, notorious word, difficult word to use, right? Radically different meanings on both sides of the Atlantic. Radical different meanings. So Kate and I are currently sitting about 100 miles apart, and in our two sites, the word liberal is used in very, very different way in Canada and the United States. That is absolutely true. However, I would suggest that the use of liberalism in this text is yet another usage that goes beyond what would be common on either side of the Atlantic. I won't quibble with the label objectors. That seems fair enough, except to note that this too could create some contextual confusion. If any of the people that Kate cites as the objectors would give a lecture in my department, and in fact several of them actually have, they would just be received as entirely uncontroversial mainstream historians. In fact, my label for them, I just say they're good scholars, but maybe that's a little too judgmental. In any case, some of this critique I'm making here might sound like nitpicking, but it illustrates a broader disciplinary divide that I'm trying to sort of put on the table here. The social scientist needs to give formations non-local names in order to make them legible in non-local contexts. I guess I would ask, why would we want to do that? Or more precisely, what do we lose when we do that? I'm not suggesting, and this is where I think historians are often misunderstood with this argument. I'm not suggesting that we always have to use the vocabulary of the people we study. That would not be, first of all, not possible, and second of all, it would be hypocritical because I'm as prone to using broad ideological labels as anyone is. But I would argue that our terminology, just like our methodology more broadly, needs to be inductive rather than deductive. That is, our labels need to be in dialogue with the labels used on the ground, diverging when necessary, but always striving to say proximate to the action on the ground, so as to remain intelligible to the actors themselves. Insofar as this sometimes means that it's difficult to generalize beyond specific instantiations, well, that might be a sign that we found something that we, in fact, shouldn't generalize about. When historians make argument like this, we're often accused as being opposed to generalization. I don't think that's quite right. Instead, what historians strive to do when they approach the past and different sites in the present is to view it as what Hunter Gadamer called a discursive circle, a foreign discursive circle, into which we have to engage in an active translation to understand. But we see our work as primarily interpretive. And that is what I see in Kate's book, a brilliant piece of interpretive analysis of a early 21st century Polish politics. Acts of interpretation draw upon generalizations and continuities while simultaneously prioritizing specificities and discontinuities. Instead of viewing human society as a field populated by instantiations of ideal types, we see each phenomenon as a product of a chronological and spatial flow, in which the meaning of the flow itself is produced through a never-ending process of contestation over memory. In other words, it's all memory politics all the way down, and that's basically all there is. And we are never separate from this process. This book, like every work of history, I'm going to appropriate your book if you don't mind here, and adopt you as a historian, is part of the same mnemonic struggle that it is analyzing. And that typology, therefore, should be seen simultaneously as a description and analysis on the one hand, and as an intervention on the other. Now, if we read the book in this way, we see it as a description of the period of 2005 to 2015 and an intervention in 2023, which is the publication date. One of the more interesting political, and this is where I think I actually might have a disagreement with Kate, although we can see if there actually is a difference here, I'm not sure. One of the interesting political debates in Poland recently has involved a neologism that it's a neologism in Polish, and I love it. I wish we could have it in English as well. The word is symmetrism. Now, this term emerged shortly after 2015, but it has enjoyed some popularity among an ideologically very diverse group of people. Symmetrism, to turn it into English, involves the claim. Well, there's a political slogan you'll sometimes hear in Poland, even in this election campaign: "Peace PO jedno zło." Peace and civic platform, the same evil. This is a popular slogan on those even further among those even further to the right than peace, but it's also seen on the left in Poland as well. when Kate argues that there is minimal policy divergence between PiS and PO, or SLD for that matter, prior to 2015, I agree. I'm not going to contest that at all. I do think, though, that this ceased to be true pretty quickly after 2015. And and this is where this is important, and that altered the ground both for conventional politics and for memory politics afterwards. Significantly, there have been profound changes that have taken place since 2015 that I think require us to use past tense verbs when describing the analysis of this book. The rise and fall, for now, of PiS coincided with a very important generational shift. Within this, here's a sobering thought that bothers me when I think of it. Within the next 3 or 4 years, everyone with adult memories of the PRL will be at retirement age. I mean, that's me too. So I feel, and I don't like to think about this, but we're basically on our way out the door. Those of us who have any adult memories of the Polish People's Republic, very soon we're going to be gone. And this is already leading to, I think, a really important change when we think about the memory politics of the moment. And I think this builds upon the memory politics of the period before 2015. Kate cites in this book a great volume that came out in 2010 by Jakub Majmurek and Piotr Szumlewicz. The book was called PRL bez uprzedzeń, the PRL without prejudice. Now, at the time that book came out, 2010, it was way outside the mainstream. It did not sell very well. It didn't get that much conversation. I myself didn't discover it until several years later because it didn't rise to my radar right away. Okay, jump forward 1 decade. In 2020, the best-selling nonfiction book in Poland was Adam Leszczyński's Historia Ludowa Polski. And that was itself part of a wave of revisionist history books that came out in 2019, 2020, 2021. Some academic, some quite a few, very popular. It's when my own book, Całkiem Zwyczajny Kraj, A Perfectly Ordinary Country, came out. That was 2021. And when my book came out, I was expecting 2 things. First, I was expecting that very few people would read it because I'm a historian, an academic historian, so I'm used to that. The second thing I was expecting was that there would be a lot of negative pushback. And that, I would get all this hate mail because I was writing that, a polemic with the martyrological approach to Polish history. And that's not what I have encountered. When I give public presentations in Poland, I keep expecting someone to stand up and be angry with me, and it never happens, or at least rarely happens. I get some nasty emails, but there's not that many. Instead, what I keep hearing is, oh, finally, we're hearing that what we've really wanted to hear. Finally, there's someone who's telling us to stop paying attention to history. Strange argument for me coming from a historian, but that is kind of the argument. Now, that's just a personal anecdote, but I've spoken, for example, with Adam Leszczyński, and he's made similar comments about the surprising enthusiasm with which a younger generation of readers has been greeting work like this. Over the past several years, the anti-PiS opposition, particularly among young people, has been quite explicitly rebelling against not just the party's authoritarianism, but polityka historyczna, or political politics, or historical politics as such. And this has had many negative connotations, actually. I think we can see some of this in the political party Konfederacja. But it's also had some positive connotations, I think, in the enthusiasm to consider very revisionist types of history. So memory politics, and I'm wrapping up here, memory politics remains important, but in different ways, and I think to a markedly and notably lesser degree than before 2015. The current presidential campaign is really revealing in this regard. Karol Nawrocki, PiS's nominee for president, is a very bad candidate. He is doing very poorly, and part of that is just because he is totally lacking in charisma and not a very good politician. But also because I think his sponsor, Jarosław Kaczyński, doesn't realize that it isn't 2015 anymore. He selected, Karol Nawrocki's background was head of the Institute for National Memory, which was the key vessel for Law and Justice's historical politics. And I think Kaczynski imagined that he could still play the mnemonic memory card because it had worked before. And it does work today among people of a certain generation. But the rise of Confederacja on the right and the rise of a sort of much more presentist liberalism on the left shows that it's just not working anymore, at least not in the same way. Confederacja, the Confederation far-right party, is, of course, it's anti-communist, of course. But if you actually listen to Sławomir Mencen's speeches, it's really quite striking how focused he is on the 21st century, not on the PRL. For his part, Rafał Trzaskowski, the currently leading candidate in the election, is running a campaign that makes me think his staff must have read Kate's book. Because the whole campaign can be viewed as an attempt to kind of rescue left liberalism from the legacy of the older generation of late communist intelligentsia. He's been trying to demonstrate very, very hard that he's not one of the dziadersi, as a slang term that was coined back in 2020 to refer to that generation of Michnik, Kuron, Tusk, Kaczynski, me, all of us who kind of came of age in the 70s and 80s. Now, Trzaskowski has not been entirely successful. He can't run away from the fact that he is still attached to a political party that has been, quite disappointing in terms of, particularly in terms of women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and such as that. But he has been successful enough in this distancing effort to make him a pretty solid favorite, knock on wood, at this moment in the election campaign. So, to sum up, to use Kate's metaphor, I think we're witnessing a market crash in the value of mnemonic capital. Not just in Poland, but actually, I think, elsewhere as well. And like every market crash, it was caused by a crisis of overproduction. And that crisis of overproduction is the story that we see in this book, right? And also, like any economic crash, this one is guaranteed to generate its own economic rebound. Already we see mnemonic entrepreneurs, if you'll forgive my switch of metaphors from military to economic, that are seeding the field for new investment opportunities in mnemonic capital, but they are ones which are focused on one's approach towards the period 2015 to 2023, and not the communist era anymore. So if I'm right about all this, we definitely want to applaud this book. I really enjoyed reading this book, and if for those of you who haven't yet, please do. But I also want to historicize this book. That I mean historicize it as a work coming out in 2023, and if I may be so bold, to appropriate this book as a first-rate work of history. I think we need to approach it as a description of a historical process that created a historical condition, which after 2015 created a new field for mnemonic politics to play itself out, one that is continuing to evolve into this present. So like any good work of history, this book allows us to understand how the process led to where we are now, even as the ideological communities it describes have continued to transform up to our present day. So once again, thanks so much for inviting me here, and thanks to Kate for writing such a provocative and interesting book.
Kate, would you like to respond to the comments of Brian?
If I may do so very briefly, and it will be perhaps lacking in coherence because I received a lot, so please bear with me. I think that what I want to say is, I think, thank you. Thank you for this deep reading. Thank you for adopting me as a historian, and and in some ways, thank God thank God that this book now becomes a book of history, because I think I wanted it to be history. The grammatical confusion of the tenses, you cannot imagine how I struggled with it when I was writing. I was constantly like, this doesn't sound right. I should be placing it. But there is a duration to the writing of the book, from research to thinking to writing to then editing, and like time. Anyway, so all this to say that I entirely understand and I struggled with it, and that I wrote the book writing it to an audience of not necessarily historians, but precisely political scientists and sociologists. Political scientists especially have a very static notions. They don't temporalize, they don't. So mine was a kind of a glove to the field by saying, no, this is a moving object. Nations are reinvented. This is the minutia of how they go about it. They will be doing it differently, 10 years from now. So yes, I in some ways agree with everything that you said. As to the generalizability of the monikers that I used, and why did I call them the name I called them, or do they travel? I would say that what I was meaning to articulate in the theoretical section was the notion of mnemonic capital, which comes into play at the moment of transition of what Huntington called transplacement, where the old ruler stands as legitimate player after transition to a new regime takes place. And the examples there would be Chile, Northern Ireland, South Africa, where the previous ruler remain, and therefore transition may be impure. We have not gotten rid of everybody that persecuted us before. The field place. And I wasn't claiming that the managers and liberals are going to be the exact positionalities in other settings, but I was trying to defend that there is a chance that there will be false positions, that there's going to be the old guard, that there's going to be the new, the contesting, the Solidarność camp, which is going to split because it was never coherent ideologically. And so it splits in two ways. So here we already have three parties, and they're going to try to make the field as closed as possible, and they are going to create the objectors. So the critique of why did I use the monikers? I used the monikers as they were. I wanted them to be easy for English speakers because the book is written in English. I wanted them to be acceptable to the parties themselves. That's why I didn't call managers neoliberals. I called them the managers because they were very actively promoting themselves as kind of apolitical stewards of the realm, shepherding it, into what they did. So I kind of tried to find a name that would not be contested by the participants, and yet it would be somehow legible. And I also really wanted to recover the notion that this was a process of active construction, that this was not just simply relying on endetia. This is not simply borrowing old clothes, etc. So that was, but I take your point that they may be slightly that the monikers themselves do not travel to other contexts, and they did not in any way meant to be. What is perhaps the only thing that could go is the four-way split. I think I'll end there, but and open it up to others.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brian, for your really interesting analysis of the book and of the whole situation, historical situation, or situation in our fields of research. I would like to ask our audience to ask some questions or to write them down in a chat. You are allowed to switch on your cameras and your microphones at the moment and just ask the questions. Or if you don't want to do this, just please write them in a chat, and I will give the questions to Kate and to Brian. And I see Katya here. I think you have a question. Hello. Hi.
Hi, thank you for this book and for your presentation and a very illuminating response. And in the spirit of looking at things from the present, how would things be different with regard to the current war in Ukraine that obviously has changed or has influenced the discussion of memory, post-World War II memory, and the communist experience in all of the former Soviet bloc countries, as well as Eastern Europe. So like, could you, I know this could not be part of the book because you had a certain line after which you didn't write more, but how would you see this politics of memory playing out? What would be the positions of the different groups that you have outlined? And I would love to hear from the discussant as well what he sees as a kind of battlefield of memory that is played out now in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya, for the question. I will answer it. I would say it's a complicated question. So on one hand, Brian is absolutely right that the notion of memory politics, as I described it, is losing salience by a year, by leaps and bounds right now. It kind of reformulates itself into something new that at the moment is not quite yet visible to me. What the war in Ukraine, for me, represented in the context of my work rather than itself, was the fact that the presence of migrants on Polish soil. Did this represent a challenge to my notion that Poles are imagined by their elites to be exclusivist and closed nation? And so this was a kind of it came to me as a question in one of the talks that I gave about the books. Did the welcome of Ukrainian people represent a departure from my notion of how Poles are imagined? And my answer had to be cautious in that maybe, but I am not necessarily seeing any evidence that Ukrainian people are welcome on Polish soils because they're expected to return home. They're not expected to remain. I just saw a poll, and obviously understanding is that at the moment they cannot, but should they be able to return, would they be welcomed as guests on your soil, or would they become a stranger that is someone who comes and stays? And I think that the expectation that they leave suggest, and I am not saying I know I've measured it in any way, but I would say that if this intuition is correct, then the power of the narration in which Paul is a kind of considered to be ethno-religious being holds, and that's unfortunate. That the punctured narration hasn't yet worked its magic, and as Brian says, with the new generation, perhaps it will.
You know, when you asked I just quickly looked up something to check a date. So in 2016, the film Volyn was released in Poland, referring to the Volhynia massacre of World War II. And I think what would be an interesting thought experiment is to imagine what would happen, what the reception would be if that film were released today. Mm-hmm. And this, it's a film which depicted a very horrific event that Ukrainian partisans, when Ukrainian partisans massacred tens of thousands of Poles during the Second World War. I would like to suggest, and this is just the thought experiment, but I think it would be viewed with great criticism by the present moment of the intelligentsia in Poland. It would immediately be seen, I think, in Poland today as an extremely partisan film in a way that it was not viewed in 2016. To be honest, I found it a little problematic in 2016, but I think generally it was extremely well received at that time. I don't think it would be today, precisely because the terrain of debate over historic memory regarding Ukraine, regarding World War II, regarding earlier times as well, has shifted in important ways. Kate is absolutely right. The opinion surveys currently show that a very large plurality, I'm not sure majority, but at least a plurality of Poles would like the Ukrainians to leave. But there are a significant number that are in fact starting to grapple with the reality that Poland needs immigration if it is to continue to function. It's just the population is too young, and as soon as that conversation opens up in Poland, there's the immediate recognition: if we need immigration, wouldn't we rather have Slavs? It becomes racialized very quickly. At least we can have some white people as opposed to having immigrants from further afield. And the way in which the rhetoric of immigration in civic platforms, sort of the left liberals, I'd call them, I guess is how we maybe call them nowadays to make them legible. The rhetoric is that, well, there's good immigration and there's bad immigration, and it is spatially determined. Immigration coming across from Ukraine, coming in, near Przemysl, that's good immigration, because those are, well, this is the part they won't say. Those are white people. We like those immigrants. Then there's the immigrants that come a couple hundred kilometers to the north, coming across the Belarusian. And Trzaskowski himself, and Tusk even more vehemently, has said, those are the immigrants we don't want. And so you get a situation where on the right, it says, we don't want immigrants. And then the sort of polite centrists want to say, well, of course, we want to support Ukrainians, and so therefore we don't want to talk about the nasty historical politics anymore. That is not productive, and we want to find a way to enable immigration from Ukraine that we can assimilate. And then if you read a magazine like Politica, which is a good representation, I think, of sort of liberal or even sometimes social democratic thought. Much discussion about how Poland needs to have politics of assimilation, a politics of acculturation, and to accept that we will need these immigrants and that we need to prioritize between the ones that we can assimilate and the ones that we cannot. So I think, I think we are seeing a shift in this debate and a politicizing of it.
Thank you very much, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? As I said, you just can ask the question or write it down in a chat. I can't read any questions in the chat. I have a lot of questions myself because it's pretty my field of research. That's why. I would like to ask again if someone wants to ask the question from the audience. I don't want to take the time from you if you have any, but it's not this situation. Oh, Artur, okay. Mr. Lipiński.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Artur Lipiński. I'm from Adam Mickiewicz University, and I haven't read the book so far. So what's the confession from the very beginning? Only an article published in East European Politics and Societies. And I've got one question regarding the issue of the relationship between anti-communism and anti-Semitism. Because it's from what I heard today, it seems to me that you're assuming that the right-wing guys, they basically equate communists with Jews in order to be able to exclude them from the nation and praise the nation as such as kind of anti-communist entity in general. So it allows, this operation allows them to exclude the communist evil from the core of the nation, right? Is that your point, or is it like more sophisticated question? I'm asking that because I was following this anti-communist discourse on the basis of the empirical data from the 90s. And at that time, there was already very strong internal split among very, let's say, radical but marginal milieus, which were very anti-Semitic, with their roots in neo-Andezia. And on the other hand, Jarosław Kaczyński, Lech Kaczyński, Porozumienie Centrum, who are very explicit about anti-Semitism as something, let's say, as something external. I mean, as something very, 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 very. They were basically very critical of anti-Semitism. That's what I want to say. And they, at that time, until 2005, they draw a very clear line between themselves and the people from neo-Andezia milieu, from Radio Maria, from League of Polish Families. So basically, they did not equate the figure of communism with the figure of Jew. And they rather did not use anti-Semitism as a kind of instrument of anti-communism. So that would be my first point. Then, if you are basing your work on the constructivist assumption, then it would be, I think, very interesting, instead of essentializing the figure of communist as used by anti-communists in their struggle over the past, it would be probably even more interesting, but also challenging, to check to what extent and how the label, the moniker of communist is being used in the public debates. Because nowadays it became kind of an empty signifier, meaning almost everyone who is against, let's say, law and justice, or even more nationalistic medias in Poland. So to be Lewak, or being lefty, or being communist or post-communist, or representing kind of post-communist ideas. I mean, there are many variants and discursive constructions to glue various actors with communism. I think it would be also very, very, very interesting, let's say, research enterprise. So I would be interesting, I mean, about your thoughts about this, I think, much more complex relationship between anti-communism and anti-Semitism. How would you see that?
So I thank you very much for the question. It kind of allows me to maybe talk about the method of the book, or the method with which I conducted my analysis, which what it did in the analysis of narratives as woven by different fields. It confronted the ostensible self-presentation. This is who we are. We are against anti-Semitism. I confronted that statement with the way they told the story of the past. And in that confrontation, what emerged is that the performative anti-Semitism is one thing, but the anti-Semitism is the kind of the conflation is snuck in the actual storytelling. So and that to me was what was interesting about it, is not to sort of have I caught you at your being anti-Semitism moment. The point was what that does to the conception of nation that emerges in the story. I wasn't interested in actors, and I wasn't interested in intentions. I was interested in the story and the power of the story, but I kind of keep steady the notion that there is a content of the story and that there is a meaning of the story, and they are not necessarily, they're never the same, and that I got to the meaning by the confrontation of the how with the what. And in that regard, I would say that many people on the right claiming to be against anti-Semitism, in the way they told the story, would most certainly replicate the conflation of the communists. And as to the signifier, kind of the point of my book, that it was an empty signifier performing closing the field, that if you do not kind of perform anti-communism, you stop being legible as an act and lose political voice.
Brian, do you want to say something to this question?
Maybe just
or add something to the question?
Yeah, I just want to just say that that ever since the 1970s, at least, it has become very, very hard in the United States to retain political legitimacy while explicitly repeating racist tropes. Although that's changing like this year, but that has been the case in the past. But nonetheless, the structures, social structures of racism, continue to exist both at a discursive and a societal level. In Poland, the situation is a little different because there's not structural anti-Semitism in the sense that there are institutions or norms in societies that perpetuate these, because of course such a small number of Jews are left. However, the discursive construction of the anti-Semitic field is something that has a history of about 125, 150 years, in some aspects even further. And it is such that when you start talking about conspiracy theories of any type, when you start talking about hidden actors, when you start talking about agents who are manipulating Polish society for the destruction of Christian civilization, when you use a phrase like that, you are not explicitly, perhaps not even subjectively, evoking anti-Semitism. But nonetheless, you are participating in a discursive field which has a history, and it has a history which has been linked to Jews, and in fact, in which Jews played the central role for since at least the 1880s, if not even earlier. And as a result of that, when you engage in that, and it is entirely possible, and you see it today. For example, you will see right-wing figures. Agnieszka Graf has written wonderful work about how people will just take people have taken what were formerly anti-Semitic tropes and just put gay where Jew was, and it's the same story. But that story only functions because of that historical legacy in which the Jews were playing the central role. So what happens is, one participates in this discursive space that then enables the perpetuation of anti-Semitism, even if one's own subjective stance is not explicitly or even consciously aware of doing so.
Well, yeah, I think it's a very important point. I'm not sure whether I make myself clear. I mean, it's pretty obvious for me that studying public narratives is not studying intentions. And one should not attribute intentions while studying public narratives to specific actors. I think you consider your fourfold like typology as kind of discursive positions rather than specific actors and specific empirically available groups. So it's all clear for me. My point was rather that, I mean, you mentioned Agnieszka Graf. Of course, one can do such kind of exercise, like using specific discourse and establish some kind of parallel with another discourse. But maybe these two discourses, anti-Semitic discourse and homophobic discourse, represent kind of the wider structure of exclusionary discourse. So, I mean, that was a normative statement, I would say, more than the analytical statement, to equate Jews or to project LGBT community as current Jews or contemporary Jews. But maybe there is something much more structural and universal behind that language, which is about exclusion of the other. Not so, and that's my point here. Like, I'm not sure, or I would say that if you use anti-Semitism or the discourse about Jews and mix it with anti-communist language or the Sometimes about Jews, sometimes about LGBT people, sometimes it's about European Union, sometimes about something else. But what matters is that all specific construction are the European Union, Brazil, and Moscow. So linked with okay.
I would add this. I actually think there's an even deeper story here. This isn't really just the story about the period that Kate looks at. If we look at the history of anti-communism as an ideology, the linkages between anti-communism and anti-Semitism are quite inextricable for most of the 20th century. You know, I'd urge you, there's a great book by Paul Hannebrink, The Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, that came out about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. He's focusing on the period of mid 20th century and showing how this functions. I earlier wrote about the history of the Catholic Church in Poland, showing the degree to which their anti-communism was imbricated with anti-Semitism. Now, these are contingent linkages, and your point in that regard is exactly right. But they are longue durée contingent linkages. So much so that if you look at the politics of the late 1940s in Poland, let's say the last year of the war and the first couple of years after the war, and you look at the arguments over policy, it is quite surprising to look at the platforms of groups like the Narodowe Siły Zbrojne, for example, other far right-wing organizations, on matters of nationalizing the economy, instituting a planned economy, having a centralized economy, equalizing the distribution of income, on almost every what we would normally understand as policy point. They are almost exactly echoing what the communists are saying and what the PPS is saying. There were several consensus documents written before, coming out of the AK before the end of the war, that on policy matters, actually, to a 21st century ear, they sound communist or at least socialist. But where are the differences? The differences are that on the right, when they use the word communism, it almost makes no sense, because you cannot understand what they are arguing against. But what they mean by communist is foreign, and what they mean by foreign is Jewish. And it becomes clear in NSF documents, for example, quite frequently. So there's a long history here. It is not a necessary. It cannot. The two strands cannot be reduced to each other, but they just cannot be. They simply cannot be separated. And I see that Dariusz Stola is here, and he's someone who definitely can speak wisely on this topic.
Please, Stola, you can ask your question, please, or make your comments, please.
Well, listening, I haven't read the book, unfortunately, yet. But when I'm listening to you, I think immediately, as a contrarian, about cases that contradict, especially this idea of essential conflation of Jewishness and communism, namely the idea of good Polish communists, like General Moczar, the anti-Semite inside the party. I have never heard anyone claiming that General Jaruzelski was Jewish. So, communists, the anti-communists are ready to blame communists even when they have no reason to believe these communists are Jewish. So there is no perfect conflation. I don't even think there is, except for really marginal groups. There is a majority conflation of these two groups because of, first, the development of the idea that there are good Polish, well, not communist, party members. And that was a factor behind a powerful attempt to renew socialism in Poland by claiming that the dark side of communism in Poland was Jewish, the Stalinism was Jewish. But there is also a good way of being communist, which is non-Jewish. And I think that is, it demands us to distinguish between what's Jewish and what is communist. And second, well, the question of General Jaruzelski, the living communist in the 1990s, the man who personified the martial law in Poland. He was accused of many things, but not of being Jewish. So I would restrict, while agreeing that there is a number of groups and people who are more than eager to claim that what was communist was Jewish and what was Jewish was communist. One more case. Good anti-communist Jews, the desire to show up good Jews who are anti-communist. A certain fascination with Mr. Netanyahu Israel, which we have seen during the rule of Prawo and Sprawiedliwość. So I think we should nuance this image a little bit. And this is not to defend anti-communist or anti-Semite, although I can imagine a legitimate anti-communism. I cannot imagine a legitimate anti-Semitism, but I imagine a legitimate anti-communism. And I think I was a legitimate communist back in the 1980s. I had good reasons to be against the communist regime at that time, while not being anti-Semitic, as far as I remember. And I know a few more people who share this combination of features. So this is just to provide some nuance. But otherwise, I'm very glad we have this discussion, especially with Brian here. Because what we are missing, we have this long debates on this exactly topic, Jews, communism, and Poland, to go back to the title of the famous book by Krystyna Kersten, which was already 33 years ago when she wrote it. It's been a long time ago. But I think that being an insider and outsider at the same time, having this perspective, which we lack, which I don't have it. I'm too much inside this Polish debates, and you have this perspective. So I'm listening with great interest of what you've been saying in the past hour and a half. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions in our audience? If not, yes, I'm not sure we are having, we are almost here for 1 hour and a half, but I would still like to ask you some question that's not so connected to Żydokomuna or the concept of Żydokomuna in Poland, but on inventing memories and inventing heroes as focusing on your political agenda. What I was thinking at this moment was this concept on cursed soldiers that was also created by Peace as this, on the other side of this evil of Jewish communism or Żydokomuna, as this pure Polish soldiers. They were fighting against Jews, against communism, fighting for the pure Polish nation. And how you can explain erasing of such concepts. What I was thinking about is like, is it a kind of having your own history created or your collective memory created, to have it, not to have contested to others, because all the history of solidarity after they split it in those different political parties, like having a liberal or more nationalistic or patriotic, or even the way like Peace or Porozumienie Centrum and Unia Demokratyczna in the 90s, they contested this history of solidarity. Who was more the better Pole, who was not, who was maybe working for the communists, as they created this concept of Bolek, talking about Wałęsa. And what is your opinion on creating such a pure and your own, not contested new history, or history that happened but was never important for the Polish society? Because I come from Poland as well, so I can't remember talking about cursed soldiers that it was really important. We are talking about what happened in Ukraine. We are talking about Katyn. But we never talked about cursed soldiers as really important from Polish history. And for funny thing that really Mota was talking about, and who was like, I think the first person that recreated this good partisans as kind of cursed soldiers. And this was also in the context of anti-Semitism at this time. So this is my question. What do you think about creating such as collective memories that didn't really exist before in the conscience of the society?
I think my answer would be that the recovery or the creation of a notion of a cursed soldier was part and parcel of a political play at the time, of inventing yourself as a victim. And victimhood confers on you the mantle of innocence. So you no longer need to account for what happened in its complexity, murderous complexity. You are creating yourself as a victim of an imposed regime, which you valiantly fought, etc. So look, I was analyzing a political scene in a newly emergent state that doesn't have working roads, that is establishing its money system. Why on earth do people talk about the past? They have so many things to talk about. Roads, schools, I don't know, everything. And yet they talk about cursed soldiers. I understand this may have been important to some people, but politically it was an incredibly kind of incredible idea that had to do with the notions of innocence. And one could say, and that's not me, one could say that this has to do with some kind of unprocessed traumas, etc., and that it kind of comes up that way, but it's not me. I don't necessarily subscribe to those kind of narratives. And I most certainly want to have serious historical debate about who did what to whom, but I doubt we would be venerating them at the end of the day. That would be, and that was the point of the new mythology.
Talking about
I'm of course Sorry, I'm just, of course, showing my ideological stripes by saying this. Other people would be saying, Brian pointed out that my book is part of the story it tells, which of course it is. And yes, so I am in that book, and I have an ideological position to what I'm describing, even as I stand outside of it. Sorry, go ahead, Alina.
No, I'm also saying is like you that you're not able to write history or anything without your own position in the system. But what I was thinking, as Brian was talking about history and documents and writing about the documents, of course, it's important to which extent you are letting the documents speak and to which extent you are speaking by yourself. That is what I have this discussion about Jedwabne in Poland. On the other hand, you have your political memory that you are creating about the role of Poles in Holocaust, only Shoah, what I prefer. And on the other hand, you have some historians that are not so they want to do their job well, and they are just looking to the documents, and they are saying a different story that we have in our collective memory about the roles of Poland and Poles in Shoah. So I think this is the difference. You can have you will never be just the documents that they are talking. You have always the position of historians, or the point of time you are living as a historian. But on the other hand, you can try to do it as far as you can to let the documents speak, and on the other hand, you can just create your own history, and they are not being concerned about the documents, more thinking about the emotions you are creating, talking about the situations.
You know, when I mentioned briefly that course that we teach, the Introducing to Historical Methodology, one of the exercises I ask the students to do when I teach that class is I say, tell me the story of today, starting from the moment you woke up until now. You have one page. You have 5 minutes and one page. And they then do the exercise, and then I have them read what they've written, and I say, okay, what didn't you say? What happened that you didn't say? And they'll say something like, well, I related everything that's important. Why did you find it important? And then that, of course, requires them to engage in introspection. Every historian knows this phenomenon of going into the archives and requesting, looking up in the archival finding guide for all the relevant documents, and then finding, there is no way I can read all this. And even if I read all this, there's no way I can relate all of this. So we have to begin, well, what is important? And already that is a judgment which is necessarily subjective. That cannot be escaped. So history is different from explicit political memory work insofar as we can't just make stuff up, right? But when we're engaged in an act of selection, it is selective, and we might try to be as faithful to the documents as we can, and certainly that's part of the disciplinary mandate. But it is vital that we recognize and prioritize our own subjective stance as someone making selections. Because only if we say, I am trying to be faithful to the documents, then what we are doing is we are suppressing our own subjectivity. And that is when the subjectivity is going to cause us problems. But we have to recognize there is no other history outside of subjectivity.
And maybe if I could just add that there are also no such thing as natural facts or even natural documents. Every document read by 5 people will say something different. So, but of course, historians do have ways of accounting for this, and if they're trained well, they are going to have an awareness of the fact that they don't come as tabula rasa to another tabula, to a rasa that has written things on it. Yes, whereas memory activists or memory entrepreneurs are not necessarily going to have that sort of awareness. They're just going to play for the sake of present day payoffs.
Thank you very much. I'm asking once again, and then last time, if we have any other questions, any further questions in our audience. If not, I would like to say thank you very much for this really interesting seminar and this discussion, also to our discussants and our audience for your questions and your remarks. And thank you very much and have a nice evening. And the recording will be available soon. I hope it will work well because we had some connectivity problems. We are in Germany, Daria and myself, and we don't have a good internet, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.